We have another hour of awesome content and dialogue. We really have been saving some of the best for the final hour, so stick with us. We have our third panel of the day focused on the topic of shifting right. It's going to focus on some of the shortcomings of the shift left movement and the benefits of shifting right, and strategies for really scaling the practice across hypergrowth environments and in hypergrowth engineering teams. Please join me in welcoming some of our panelists. We have Rob Zuber, who is CTO of CircleCI, a leading CI/CD platform I'm sure pretty much everyone in the room is familiar with, and also a Sapphire portfolio company. We have Jonathan Nolen, who is SVP of Engineering at LaunchDarkly, a feature flagging and experimentation platform. And our moderator today will be Adam Liu, who is an investment associate on Sapphire's infrastructure practice. Adam, over to you.
Thank you. Where do we sit?
Mic test. Cool. Hey, guys.
Hello.
How's everyone doing?
Hello.
Thanks, Shruti, for the warm introduction. As Shruti mentioned, my name's Adam. I'm an associate on the team. Maybe to kind of level set here, right? We've all heard about DevOps at this point. We've all heard about this continuous cycle of progressive delivery. What we're hearing a little bit more about these days is this whole concept of shifting right? Or bringing things like performance evaluation, quality assurance, testing, all of that stuff rightward in the SDLC, and doing these things actually in production environments, doing these things under real-world conditions with real kind of user load, right? So maybe talking through some of the benefits quickly, right? What does this bring? So this brings you more consistency. It brings you a little bit more visibility and all of that kind of stuff, all while having more control and all while having access to this feedback loop. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to you two. Maybe the first question for Rob is, we've heard a lot about shifting left. What are some of the kind of challenges with shifting left first?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I'll try to recap as quickly as possible. I mean, I think everyone's probably familiar if you're talking about shifting left and shifting right. But typically when we're talking about shifting left, we're trying to do things earlier, find errors earlier, know that there are errors earlier, and we focus on that because the cost of fixing is generally lower, right? But what's interesting is the cost of finding those errors isn't necessarily always lower as you go to the left, and the left being the desktop and the right being production or laptop, wherever you write your code, whatever. And so what I mean by that is there are certain classes of errors, particularly, we were just hearing about the supply chain, for example, where I'm integrating all these pieces together, some of which aren't even libraries that I'm using, but third-party services maybe that are changing their behavior on the fly, right? Or who's not using a ridiculously large data set at this point that you will never get into a test environment, right? So the reality of the situation is you're always going to find errors in production, right? We talked some discussion of incidents earlier as well. And so if you're always going to find errors in production, then, that's one limitation. That's a fact, right? Already you are going to find issues in production. So how do you start thinking about mitigating and reducing the cost and the risk of the fact that you're finding issues in production, right? So how do you, tool around the problem that you are going to identify issues in production? And what's interesting about that is as you start to do that, you start to identify other places where maybe that's actually a better way to work. And there's specific classes, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe kind of turning it over to you, Jonathan, like if you think about this whole concept of shifting right now, what do you think are some of the top benefits? Like if you were to distill it down to 1 to 3 benefits, like what would you say are the key takeaways here?
Yeah, so fundamentally there's really just one core benefit that I think outweighs all the other ones, and that is essentially speed. Speed is obviously a huge competitive advantage here, and operating this way can really increase speed in a very particular way. And I think about this in terms of engineering efficiency, really. You can sort of look at any engineering team, and you can get some rough sense of how they're operating, how efficient they are, if you can look at how much time do they spend trying to reduce risk, and how much time do they spend trying to create value. And so if you can shift the way you operate and the way that you push change to maximize the progress you're delivering, because you're able to focus more on what you're actually creating, what business value you're trying to drive, and less on making sure that you haven't made a mistake early in the process. Then you're getting much more value through the pipeline. You're getting a much more efficient engineering team, because you have found ways to mitigate those problems in production, to deal with them quickly, to make the cost of those problems so low that you're able to move forward with confidence, and you don't have to spend 80% of your time writing tests or trying to find things in advance, because you know you can deal with them at the end of the pipeline.
Right, and it kind of goes back to the whole saying of you want to fail small and fail quickly, right? Rob, did you have anything else to add?
I think that's exactly right, which is there's kind of a few dimensions to how you can make that impact smaller, right? You can reduce the number of customers that are exposed to a change, for example, as you're putting it out. You can reduce the time that it's going to be out there. You can reduce the scope of that change. All of those things reduce the impact, and when you get to the point where that potential impact actually feels safe or inconsequential, then to Jonathan's point, you can move faster, because you don't spend all of this time trying to be perfect up front, but rather you feel confident that even if there is an issue, you're going to be able to deal with it. It's going to be low impact to your business.
Right. So the general concept has been around for quite some time, right? You two were both practitioners that were doing this well before you started working on the products at your respective companies. Why is it becoming more top of mind these days? Why are people talking about it more?
I would point to complexity, meaning it's gotten harder to actually solve your problems or identify issues before you put something in production, right? Again, larger data sets, more complex supply chain, the way we build software is we've solved certain problems by introducing different kinds of complexity. And so I think the ability to reason about a change in a manner that I can deal with it before I put it in a production environment and truly identify all those eventualities, again, deal with those large data sets. There's just certain classes of problems that are becoming more prevalent. And so we're seeing more issues as a result. We're operating at larger scales, and therefore we've started to build good tooling as opposed to just say, oh, this would be a nice to have or an interesting process to pursue.
Right. Jonathan, did you have anything else?
Yeah, totally agree with all that. There is an ever-increasing interdependence in the way that we build software, and it's really hard to replicate that in non-real environments. The other trend that I'm seeing is that these techniques, these ideas have existed for a long time, but most teams were not able to invest in them, and certainly not at a scale or professionalism that you could do anything more than the barest minimum. Fortunately, over the last 5 or 10 years, more and more third-party companies are allowing teams of any size, any scale, to easily and affordably adopt these techniques, to use a platform to give you things like feature management in my case, and the kinds of practices and techniques that only sort of the largest and most well-resourced teams could have afforded 10 or 15 years ago, that has now been democratized, and essentially teams of any size could start on day one with a really mature tool set and with a really mature practice. And they don't ever have to debate the choice of should I spend time creating value for customers, or should I spend time in improving my tool chain? There's a whole army of companies out there whose life's mission is to improve that tool chain for you.
Right. Now, transitioning a little bit to how people are actually using this in practice, right? Maybe starting with you, Jonathan, what strategies have you kind of seen for shifting right?
Sure. So there are a lot of, I'll use this word again, interdependent strategies. You can sort of adopt them in any order, but they all tend to benefit each other. So I'll start with my book, and practicing some feature control, some feature management is an incredibly effective way to help you ship with more confidence. And you can sort of start that without having really anything else in place, but by wrapping every change that you push to production into a control flag. That means that when things go wrong, you can instantly fix that no matter how slow your deployment process might be. Now, that's not the situation you necessarily want to live in. So if you have a slow deployment process, then you're well served to figure out how do you speed that up? How do you reduce the amount of change that we ship in a given bundle? How do we make sure that we're actually deploying continuously, and you push sort of in that direction? And then in order to do that confidently, then you have to make sure that you've invested well in observability. You can actually understand what's going on in production. You can understand whether the thing the change you were introducing is having the effect that you want or unintended effects. You also need a strong incident process. As Rob was saying earlier, things are going to happen. Incidents will always happen. And so really the way we should measure ourselves is how well we deal with them and how quickly we can deal with them. And so if you've built that into your engineering culture, that is another really important weapon. And all of these things sort of layer on top of each other to give your team more control and thus more confidence. So, as I said before, they spend less time trying to reduce risk.
Yeah, there's two things that I would add to that. I'm staring at the same monitor that everyone else is in. It says testing and production. I really want to talk about that for a second, because to me, what's really important is thinking about what outcome you're trying to get or what problem you're trying to solve. And when we talk about testing and production, I see people connecting that as like, oh, I will go run my end-to-end tests once I've deployed this thing into a production environment, which is, at least is not what I mean. It's, I test because I'm trying to generate knowledge and information and signal about my software, right? So I run tests locally, which might be unit tests. I run maybe some integration tests in CI. All of that is a very singular path telling me, with this data and input, I get this output, and I believe that to be correct. The richness of data in a production environment is very different, right? It's all of these different users with all of this different historical data are executing the code that I just put into production. Me running a single test through that is not as valuable as observability. Like, what is happening in the system under all of these conditions, and what can I learn from that? The whole reason I want to learn something in that production environment is because I didn't think of that case, or I didn't have that weird historical piece of data, or I didn't have that massive data set where the database chooses a different query path than my database chose, my instance chose in my personal environment. So really separating that and saying, what is it that I'm trying to learn in this environment, and how am I learning that? It's more going to be about metrics, observability versus testing. The other thing is I really want to think about risk, and in particular, in any application, whatever business you're in. Like, we talk in the macro, I often say, like, I would be much less comfortable, pushing directly to prod on people's cars than I am if I'm building a blogging site, right? Like, please, although I've heard rumors that certain CEOs of certain electric car companies drive off Main, like, please don't push directly to my car every time someone commits. I wouldn't be super stoked about that, right? But if there's like a typo or I can't load the page on a blogging site, like, cool, I'll try again in a second, right? But within your business, you probably know what those things are. Like, this is the most important thing. Like, we're a CI company. Like, if builds aren't flowing, that's really, really bad. If people can't upgrade their credit cards, we can just let them build for now, and we'll fix the credit card problem in a second, right? Like, the difference between those things tells me this is a place where I can really push, right? Move as fast as possible, push the way that I think, maybe try new tooling, and this is a place where I have to be more cautious.
Right, that makes total sense. And then if you think about kind of, let's say I'm someone new who hasn't adopted these techniques yet, what kind of infrastructure or what kind of automation should I have in place before I embark on this journey?
You're looking at me, but if I say anything more than 2 seconds on CI and CD, then it's just turned into a sales pitch. So I think everyone knows the answers. Does anyone want to know what tools you need to have in place? We're right here. Yep. Talk to us up in the whiskey bar. We'll tell you all about it.
Okay. Well, kind of taking off your hats, right? Taking off the LaunchDarkly hats, taking off the CircleCI hats. Is there anything like from observability standpoint that you need to have, or anything like that?
Is Charity here yet? We'll start pitching in advance. I'm like looking around the room, seeing all the faces of all the people whose tools you want to buy. So they're all here. But yeah, like, absolutely, you want to have really good understanding of what's happening in your production environment. Like, if you're going to put stuff out into production under the assumption that something's going to be broken, because it is, get used to that, then how are you going to know, right? I can't answer that question for you. I mean, if you're building self-driving cars, I literally have no idea how to tell you what to look for, but something's going to be broken. So what's your telemetry? Like, how do you understand your system? Not only, this is now just going to be my personal bugaboo, not just from a service or system perspective, but what is your customer seeing right now, right? And every time, I mean, speaking about incidents, every time I show up in an incident, the first question I ask, what are customers seeing right now? Like, I get that your SLO is 96% of this thing, and like the response time is this, but you're a tiny piece of this big system. Do you understand what your customers are seeing? And if you understand that, then you're going to be a lot more comfortable taking some risks. And so, I mean, I can go into all the kind of long laundry list, but I won't, of tools but that's going to be different, again, for your business. Like, if you know what your customers are seeing, then you're going to be a lot more comfortable with it.
Yeah, there's a really interesting, I think, dichotomy that you pointed there. Most modern development teams have invested in system-level observability. We have a pretty good sense of how the engineering is performing. We have much less visibility into how the business is performing. Like, you can make changes that violate no SLO, but still change the experience in such a way that suddenly your conversion metrics drop, or your purchase price drops, or something like that. And most teams don't actually have real-time visibility into that. So I mean, I think that's a really interesting problem that we're thinking about, and we're thinking about where we can go in that direction. But there are different classes of incidents and different ways to recognize what those things are. But fundamental to this whole idea is that you have to, you shift right because you can fix things quickly, and if you can do that, then basically you've lowered the cost of being wrong enough that you can afford to think differently about the testing further upstream. But that means that you actually have to be able to do that. The cost of being wrong has to be tiny. You have to be able to identify the problem quickly, you have to be able to mitigate the problem quickly, and you have to make sure that the blast radius of the problem is really small. And there are tools that will help you with all three of those things, but that's sort of that is the baseline of this whole concept. You have to be able to be wrong cheaply.
Right.
Right. I think that, we've talked a lot about, I keep using SLO, like, as an industry, we've talked a lot about them recently, and one of the things that I love about that concept done well is it's an agreement between, I'll just call it the business, shoot me later for pretending that engineers aren't part of the business, whatever, but like between the implementer and the stakeholder about what matters, right? Customers are willing to tolerate this level of degradation in the experience, therefore that's the room we have to experiment and try new things. And that's, if we're running along that edge, then we're moving as fast as is safe for us to move, and therefore innovating as quickly as possible. And that agreement between stakeholders, let's just call it that. Engineers, we're also stakeholders, right? That agreement between all stakeholders to say we truly understand what matters to the business, and one of those things is speed, and we're going to push as fast and we're going to innovate as much as possible within what is appropriate for our customers, I think is super, super valuable. And I think we quickly turn SLOs into like it's a number.
Yeah.
But what really matters to me in that is that agreement where we all sat down and said, yes, within this level of tolerance, we can push.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about risks, and I want to spend a minute here because I think it's important. Is there anything that you have to give up to do kind of shifting right? Are there any risks? Are you doing less testing in lower level environments, or anything like that you've seen?
Well, I would say that the way you described testing earlier was a really good lens on this, is that there are sort of appropriate points in the process to do testing. Every test has a cost, and trying to learn something at the wrong stage just means that you're investing more time and more effort to try to figure out the data that you want. And there could be a much more efficient way to do that by sort of pushing things further to the right in the process. You have to be really, you have to weigh every test and every kind of test and every piece of validation that you add to your project, because it is all overhead. It has a cost that lasts forever. Every engineer from here on out will have to maintain that thing. They will have to update it when things change. They have to be aware of it. They have to understand it. And so you want to basically make that as efficient as you can responsibly do it. And one of, I think, the really powerful techniques here is to target the right kind of test at the right stage, where you're going to get the most information for the least amount of effort and the least amount of churn, all to go back, so that your engineers are actually spending their time pushing things forward, adding value to the system, not just removing risk.
Right. You mentioned maintenance. How does kind of that feature flag hygiene work?
I guess this is more directly related to LaunchDarkly, but there are feature flags get used for all sorts of things, and there are lots of use cases that are sort of meant to be permanent, right? And you can think of this as you're building and evolving your system, you're adding in the control panel that you will use to drive it in production for the rest of its life. And so there's a whole class of feature management that is targeted at that. Then there are other ones that are more around sort of the release use case, that they are intended to have a life cycle. They get ramped up, they get progressively delivered, they get to 100%, and eventually they get removed. And you need both process and tooling to do that well. Our most advanced customers are mostly managing with the process. We're adding things to the tool all the time to make this lifecycle easier. But really, the risk that you're running here, I guess, is just in the mental overhead of that complexity, right? Flags and bits of code that no longer need to be there, flags that don't need to be in your database because they're done now. That's just more things for your engineering staff to learn or understand or sort through when there's a problem. So having good hygiene there and making sure that actually those things get pruned when they are no longer useful, it is a really important part of the practice.
Great. Well, I only have one more question. I know we're short on time, but one sentence answer. Where do you think this whole space of shifting right will go? It's a hard one.
You go first. I need to think longer.
Sure. Well, I mean, like, I'll bring it full circle. Like, it is just going to go faster. Like, every team is trying across every industry, every customer we talk to. It doesn't matter whether it's a tech startup or a bank or a healthcare company or a pizza delivery company. They're all trying to operate in this rapidly able to change, continuous deployment, continuous delivery kind of world. And they're all at different places on their journey to get there, but they all see the same end goal that they're trying to get to. And so as the techniques of shifting right support that journey, they're going to be able to move faster. As everybody tries to move faster, it's going to push the techniques and the tooling and the products faster. And so I think, if you fast forward 10 years from now, right now, the best companies are operating where they can deploy hundreds of times a day, and they can control their software in production, and they can fix problems in milliseconds. And 10 years from now, I think that is going to be the baseline, not the leading edge. And we need all of the techniques that we talked about today. We need those to get there.
All right, I'm watching the clock. It's just another tool in the toolbox. We talk about, the pendulum's all the way over here, it's all the way over there, whatever. Next frontier, the final frontier, like we just have a bunch of tools. Use the right tools for the job. Jonathan said it already. It's a tool in the toolbox. It's not going to save your life, but learn how to use it, add it to your stack.
Great.
Well said.
Well, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.